Some men don't take you to dinner to know you. They take you there to remind you what they think you'll never be. Sophie Bennett understood that too late, sitting 28 stories above downtown Chicago with a glass wall to her left, a skyline full of gold reflections beyond it, and a man across from her who had spent the last 40 minutes smiling like kindness was something he rented by the hour. At first, Grant Morrison had seemed polished in the way expensive men often did. All crisp cuffs, practiced charm, and easy talk about rooftop reservations that took months to get. He had held her chair, complimented the view, ordered without looking at the menu, and made just enough eye contact to suggest he knew exactly how to make a woman feel chosen. But the minute the second round of drinks arrived, his voice changed. Softer, sharper, like a blade wrapped in velvet. He asked where she lived, then smiled when she told him she rented a small apartment on the north side. He asked what car she drove, and when she admitted she took the train most days, he laughed into his bourbon as if she had delivered the evening's best punchline. Sophie kept her shoulders straight and reached for her water, pretending not to notice the couple at the next table go quiet. Then came the final twist of the knife. Grant leaned back in his chair, glanced at her dress, and said, almost casually, "You know, from your profile picture, I thought you cleaned up better than this." The words did not hit all at once. They sank in slowly, hot and humiliating, turning her cheeks warm under the amber lights. Sophie looked down at her hands instead of at him. Her nails were neatly trimmed. Her thrift store navy dress was simple but elegant. Her heels had been resoled twice, but they were clean. She had done everything she could to look like she belonged in this room, and somehow that made the shame sting worse. Grant kept going, because men like him always did when no one stopped them. He joked about public school, about small-town energy, about how some women confused ambition with access. He asked if she always ordered the cheapest entree when she went somewhere nice, or if tonight was a special occasion. He smiled while he said it too. The kind of smile designed to give cruelty a cleaner suit. Sophie's throat tightened. She could already feel the familiar pressure behind her ribs, that old instinct to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to leave before anyone could watch her dignity crack. It was an old reflex, older than Chicago, older than bad dates, older even than the years she had spent teaching herself how to sound composed while surviving jobs that barely paid rent. It came from classrooms where other girls had nicer shoes, from forms that asked about family income, from hospital waiting rooms where she had learned, very young, that need made some people uncomfortable. She reached for her purse. "I think I'm done here," she said quietly. Grant smirked. "Probably for the best. This place isn't really your scene." And that was the moment another voice cut cleanly across the table, deep, calm, and impossible to ignore. "No," the stranger said, stepping beside them with the kind of stillness that made the whole room seem to shift around him. "What isn't her scene is being spoken to like that." Sophie looked up, startled, and for one suspended second, all she saw was a dark suit, broad shoulders, and eyes she almost recognized from another life. Grant let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind men used when they assumed the room still belonged to them. "Excuse me," he said, turning in his chair. The stranger did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply looked at Grant with the cool steadiness of someone who had spent years in rooms where one sentence could change the direction of an entire company. "You heard me," he said. "The evening is over. She is leaving with her dignity." Sophie felt every eye in the restaurant tilt toward their table, but something had shifted now. A second earlier, the attention had felt like humiliation. Now it felt like a witness. Grant straightened, offended more by being interrupted than by his own behavior. "This is between me and my date." "No," the man replied. "It stopped being private the second you decided to make her feel small in front of an audience." There was no threat in his tone, only fact, and somehow that landed harder. Grant looked around as if waiting for someone to laugh with him, someone to confirm that a woman like Sophie could still be dismissed if he said it smoothly enough. No one did. A server appeared near the table, uncertain, and the stranger turned to him with the same measured calm. "Please close out this table," he said. "Charge the full meal to me, and make sure the lady does not have to stand here another minute." Sophie should have protested. Every lesson she had learned about survival told her not to owe anybody anything, especially not a man in a suit who moved through the world like doors opened before he reached them. But her voice caught somewhere behind her ribs, and before she could force it out, Grant pushed back from the table with a scoff. Unbelievable, he muttered, grabbing his jacket. You're defending someone you don't even know. The stranger glanced at Sophie then, and for the first time she got a clear look at his face. Strong jaw, familiar eyes, a quiet gravity that stirred something old in her memory. I know enough, he said. Grant rolled his eyes and walked off toward the elevators, muttering under his breath, leaving behind the sharp smell of cologne and the deeper stink of a ruined evening. Silence settled over the table, gentle this time. Sophie stood slowly, fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. You didn't have to do that, she said, finally finding her voice. Yes, he answered, holding her gaze. I did. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, not with arrogance, but with something softer, almost disbelieving. Sophie Bennett, he said quietly. I was hoping I wasn't the only one who remembered senior year art class. The skyline blurred behind her. For a second, she was no longer 28 stories above Chicago in a rooftop restaurant she could barely afford. She was 17 again, paint on her hands, sunlight through old classroom windows, and one boy in the back row who never laughed when everyone else did. Ethan, she whispered. And just like that, the worst night she had had in years opened a door she never saw coming. She stared at him as if the years between 17 and now had folded in half, without warning. Ethan Calloway, the quiet boy from the back row with charcoal on his fingers and a habit of seeing everything before anyone else did. Only he was not a boy anymore. He stood in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, with the kind of composure that made the entire room seem built around him. And yet his eyes were exactly the same. Steady, thoughtful, gentle in a way that felt almost dangerous after a night like this, because gentleness was harder to defend against than cruelty. I can't believe that's really you, Sophie said, still holding her purse like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Ethan gave a small smile. I wasn't sure at first. Then you reached for your water the same way you used to reach for a pencil when you were deciding whether an idea was worth trusting. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It was such a strange, specific thing to remember that it cut straight through the embarrassment still clinging to her skin. The server returned with her coat, and Ethan took it from him before she could, careful and unhurried, holding it open just long enough for her to slip her arms inside. The gesture was simple, respectful, but after the ugliness of the last hour, it felt like someone turning the lights back on in a dark room. They walked together toward the windows where the city spread out in glittering lines beyond the glass, headlights moving like streams of white fire below. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie was too aware of everything. The hush of expensive shoes on polished floors, the faint jazz drifting behind them, the warmth of her coat settling around her shoulders, the fact that Ethan still moved beside her as if leaving her alone now had never crossed his mind. You disappeared after graduation, he said at last. I looked for your work online a few times, but I couldn't find anything. Sophie looked down. That's because there wasn't much to find. The honesty came out before she could dress it up. My mom got sick. College became community college, then 2 jobs, then bills. Art turned into something I used to do. Ethan was quiet for a beat, and when she risked a glance at him, she did not see pity. She saw something heavier, the kind of attention that made a person feel witnessed. As they reached a small table near the windows, Sophie realized she was still holding the cloth napkin she had twisted in, her hands all through dinner. Without thinking, she set it down and smoothed it flat. In the center, traced absent-mindedly in pen, was a quick little sketch of a logo concept. Clean lines, balanced curves, the silhouette of an open doorway hidden inside a simple geometric mark. Ethan looked at it, then back at her, and something in his expression changed. Sophie, he said softly, tell me you didn't stop seeing the world like that. For a moment she could not answer. She looked down at the sketch on the napkin and felt the old ache rise in her chest, the one that always came when she brushed against the version of herself she had left behind. I didn't stop, she said at last. I just stopped believing it could matter. That's not the same thing. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime nearby, but neither of them moved. In high school, people had noticed her grades, her secondhand clothes, the way she left campus right after class to catch the bus home. Ethan had noticed the sketchbooks. He had noticed the way she stared at store signs and magazine covers, as if she could already see how they should have been designed better. He had noticed the torn eraser in her pencil pouch, the way she drew in margins when she was anxious, the fact that her best work always came after everyone else had stopped talking. She gave a tired half-smile. You always said things like that. Like the rest of us were living in one world, and you were paying attention to another one underneath it. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. Maybe I just paid attention to you. The words landed softly, but they lingered. Not romance, not yet. Something older. Something that had once been too quiet to become anything and now stood between them with all the gravity of time. He picked up the napkin carefully, as if it were something more valuable than linen and ink. Do you mind if I keep this? Sophie blinked. It's just a doodle. No, he said, looking at it again. It's instinct. Those are usually worth more. His phone lit up in his hand. He glanced at the screen, frowned once, and silenced it without reading the message. That simple gesture should not have meant anything, but after a night of being made to feel inconvenient, it meant everything. He was choosing to stay present. Let me drive you home, he said. You've had enough for one night. Sophie hesitated. Every practical instinct told her to say no, thank him, and disappear before this evening turned into something she would replay for weeks. But Chicago glittered cold outside, and the thought of sitting alone on the train with Grant's words still ringing in her ears felt heavier than her pride. All right, she said softly. In the private elevator down, the silence between them was not awkward. It was careful, almost kind. When they reached the curb, a Blacktown car was already waiting. Sophie stopped short. The driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door with the smooth precision of someone trained never to keep important people waiting. Ethan saw the change in her face, but said nothing. He only held the door for her, patient as ever. And as Sophie slid into buttery leather seats that smelled faintly of cedar and money, one thought rose clear above all the others. Ethan Calloway had not just changed since high school. He had become someone with a world far larger than anything he had let her see. The ride north was so quiet Sophie could hear the muted pulse of traffic through the glass, and the faint tick of her own thoughts catching up to her. Streetlights slid across the window in long ribbons of gold, washing over Ethan's face and then disappearing again, as if the city itself could not decide what to reveal about him. He sat across from her in the rear-facing seat, one arm resting loosely beside him, his expression calm in a way that only made her more aware of how little she knew now. In high school, Ethan had been smart, observant, and impossible to place. He had worn plain jackets, driven an old car, and spent more time listening than talking. Nothing about him had suggested a driver waiting curbside in a Blacktown car or a restaurant staff that moved the second he spoke. Sophie folded her hands in her lap. You don't have to explain anything, she said, though the words came out thinner than she intended. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. That usually means the opposite. She glanced out the window. I just wasn't expecting this version of your life. Neither was I once, he said. There was no boast in it. No speech about hard work or destiny or becoming the man everyone underestimated. Just a fact, quietly stated, that unsettled her more than confidence would have. By the time the car stopped outside her brick apartment building, the air between them had changed again, gentler now, but weighted with things unsaid. Ethan stepped out first and came around to open her door before the driver could. Sophie climbed out, suddenly conscious of the chipped front steps, the narrow hallway light glowing behind the glass door, the planter by the entrance that had been empty since November. She hated that she noticed those things most when standing beside someone who clearly belonged to another world. Thank you, she said, pulling her coat tighter. For tonight. For stepping in. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed her a clean white business card, thick as a small promise. The lettering was simple, elegant. Ethan Calloway, founder and chief executive officer. Calloway Brands. Sophie stared at it so long the cold finally made her blink. She looked up at him, and he must have seen the shock settle in for real this time, because his voice softened. Come by tomorrow, he said. 10 o'clock. I want to show you something. Sophie let out a breath that fogged in the night air. Ethan, I can't just walk into a company like yours. You can if I ask you to. Why? She asked, and this time the question was not about money or influence or polished black cars. It was about her. Ethan glanced at the card still in her hand, Then at the memory of ink lines folded inside his pocket where he had kept her napkin sketch. Because, he said, the world didn't stop needing what you can do just because life got loud. Then he stepped back, got into the car, and left her standing under the yellow street lamp with a business card in one hand and the terrifying possibility of a different life in the other. That night Sophie barely slept. She set Ethan's card on the little kitchen table by her window and stared at it while the city moved beyond the glass in soft blurs of passing headlights. Her apartment was small enough that from the couch she could see nearly everything. At once, the narrow galley kitchen, the stack of unopened mail clipped with a grocery receipt, the shelf of thrifted mugs, the radiator that hissed like it had opinions, and in the corner near the window, a flat storage box she had not opened in months. She knew what was in it. Sketchbooks, old markers, a portfolio case with cracked plastic corners. Fragments of a version of herself she had packed away the same way people packed away summer clothes in winter, not because they stopped existing, but because the season for them had become too expensive. She knelt by the box and opened it. Paper smell rose first, then graphite, then memory. There were rough branding studies from high school, posters she had designed for student theater productions, hand-lettered ideas for imaginary coffee shops and nonprofit campaigns. Beneath them was a folded sheet of heavy paper from senior year art class, an assignment Mr. Abrams had given them on the last day before graduation. Design one sentence you want to live by. Most people had turned theirs into jokes. Ethan had drawn nothing. He had just written in sharp black ink, build things that let people breathe. Sophie remembered looking at it too long after class, then writing her own sentence on the back before slipping it into his sketchbook while he cleaned brushes at the sink. Don't become what hurt you. She sat back on her heels now, the old paper trembling slightly in her hands. She had forgotten she still had a copy. At 2 a.m. she made tea she didn't really want, sat by the window, and told herself not to be ridiculous. Men like Ethan did not see one sketch on a napkin and decide to change a woman's life. CEOs did not call old classmates into glass towers because fate had decided they were overdue. More likely he wanted a quick opinion, a polite reunion, maybe a small freelance referral if she impressed him. And yet beneath all the practical arguments was one fact she could not reason away. He had seen her. Not the embarrassment. Not the cheap dress. Not the gap between her life and that restaurant. Her. By 9:40 the next morning, Sophie was standing across the street from a tower of glass and steel so polished it seemed to catch the whole gray Chicago sky and hold it in place. Callaway Brands was written across the front in clean silver letters that looked less like a company name and more like a statement. She had changed outfits 3 times before leaving her apartment, finally settling on black slacks, a cream blouse, and the same navy coat from the night before. It was the best she could do without pretending to be someone else. Even so, as revolving doors spun and men and women in sharp tailoring crossed the lobby with coffee cups and confident strides, Sophie felt the old instinct return, that dangerous, familiar urge to turn around before anyone had the chance to measure her and find her lacking. But then she felt the business card in her pocket and forced herself forward. Inside, the lobby rose 3 stories high, all pale stone, soft light, and quiet money. A receptionist looked up, asked her name, and the instant Sophie said it, the woman's expression changed from polite to prepared. "Mr. Callaway is expecting you," she said. "Not Ethan. Mr. Callaway." The words landed with a weight that followed Sophie all the way to the private elevator and tightened around her chest when the doors opened onto the top floor. The space upstairs was all glass walls and sweeping views of Lake Michigan, but it was not cold. There were books everywhere, framed campaign art, product mock-ups, a long wall covered with pinned concepts, color palettes, typography studies, and brand boards for nonprofit initiatives and public outreach programs. Sophie slowed without meaning to. It was the kind of room built for people who believed design could change how the world listened. "I had a feeling you would head for that wall first." Ethan's voice came from behind her, low and warm enough to cut through the panic gathering in her throat. She turned. He was in a charcoal suit that morning, tie loosened, coffee in one hand, like a man who had already made 10 decisions before most people had opened their eyes. But when he looked at her, something in his expression softened. "You came. I almost didn't. I'm glad you did." He led her into a conference room, where samples from a struggling community campaign were spread across a table. Flyers, draft logos, packaging mock-ups, messaging that felt polished but empty. Ethan watched her scan them, watched the tiny shift in her face when her instincts kicked in. And she forgot to be intimidated. "What is this?" she asked. "A program we're relaunching in 6 weeks," he said. "Scholarships, workforce support, small business grants. The mission matters. The branding doesn't." Sophie picked up one of the brochures. It was sleek in the way corporate things were sleek when they wanted to appear trustworthy but not personal. Cool blue palette. Generic smiling faces. Headlines that sounded like they had been approved by 12 committees and believed by no one. "It feels like it doesn't know who it's for," she said before she could stop herself. Ethan's mouth lifted slightly. "Go on." She looked at him, then back at the material. "The people this is supposed to help already feel judged. If the visual language looks expensive, distant, and over-explained, they'll assume it isn't really for them. It needs warmth, simplicity, less hierarchy, less performance." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the table, studying her the same way he had studied her sketch on the napkin. "And the logo?" She turned the current mark sideways, then upside down, then set it down entirely. "It looks like a bank convincing itself it has feelings." That made him laugh, quiet and real. Sophie blinked. "Sorry. Don't be." He nodded toward the materials. "That's the clearest assessment I've heard in 3 weeks. She looked up. "And you want my opinion?" Ethan shook his head once. "I want more than that. I want to know whether you would consider helping rebuild it." The room seemed to still around her. "Helping how?" "As a consultant to start," he said. "Short term. Paid. You'd work directly with my team on the relaunch. If it feels right, we discuss more." Sophie stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Ethan, I haven't worked in a place like this. I don't have the resume for your boardroom." "I'm not hiring a resume," he said. "I'm asking for instinct, taste, empathy, and the ability to see what everyone else missed. Last night you drew a better mark on a napkin than my agency has given me in 3 rounds. Her face warmed. He stepped closer to the wall and pulled down one of the printed boards. "Walk me through how you'd fix it." That was how it began. Not with some impossible fantasy offer wrapped in romance, but with paper, language, color, instinct, and a man who knew the difference between polish and truth. 2 hours later, Sophie had forgotten to be self-conscious. She stood by the wall with a dry erase marker in her hand, drawing quick alternatives over acetate sheets Ethan's team had left behind. She broke the messaging apart, circled dead phrases, replaced resource accessibility framework with open the door, replaced stock imagery suggestions with handwritten notes about real faces, real neighborhoods, real light. At one point Ethan sat at the table, simply watching her work, coffee gone cold near his hand. "What?" she asked when she caught him looking. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's just strange." "What is?" "To see someone come back to herself in real time." That sentence followed her for the rest of the day. By the time she left, she had a temporary guest badge, a modest consulting agreement in her bag, and a list of deliverables that felt far too large and far too thrilling for someone who had walked into the building that morning still hearing Grant's voice in her head. When Ethan walked her back to the elevator, she stopped beside the doors. "You realize this is either incredibly generous or incredibly reckless." He smiled faintly. "I'm hoping for strategically generous." She looked at him for a beat too long. "Why do I feel like that means you've already decided I'm staying?" "Because," he said, "I know what it looks like when talent has been waiting for someone to stop underestimating it." The elevator doors opened. As she stepped inside, he reached into his folder and handed her a slim black notebook. "What's this?" "Something you forgot senior year." She opened it. Her breath caught. It was her old sketchbook from art class, thicker now, edges worn, a tiny smear of cobalt still staining the back cover. "I thought I lost this." "You left it in the studio after graduation. I kept meaning to return it." "For 15 years?" He gave the smallest shrug. "I had a feeling the right time might matter." The doors closed before she could answer. Sophie rode down 30 floors with the sketchbook pressed to her chest like something living. Hope was dangerous when you had spent years surviving on practicality, and she felt that danger all through the first week she stepped into Callaway Brands on a temporary consulting badge with her name printed in neat black letters beneath the word guest. Ethan had insisted on easing her in, just a few days, just one campaign. Just enough room to see whether her instincts still belonged in a place like this. But buildings like Callaway did not really ease anyone in. They assessed, measured, and filed impressions before a person finished their first cup of coffee. Sophie felt it in the elevator mirrors, in the polished conference tables, in the quick glances from employees whose shoes probably cost more than her monthly grocery bill. She tried to ignore it and focus on the work. That part, at least, came back faster than she expected. By the second day, she had reorganized the entire campaign wall into a cleaner visual story. She replaced sterile language with warmth, shifted the color palette from corporate blue to deep green and muted gold, and sketched a new mark that looked less like a financial institution and more like an open door illuminated from within. By the third day, even the skeptical strategy director, Vivian Mercer, had stopped calling her Ethan's consultant and started asking sharper questions. Vivian was elegant, controlled, and impossible to read. She wore ivory blouses, spoke in concise sentences, and had spent 10 years turning Callaway brands into the kind of company that could court major investors without losing social credibility. She wasn't rude to Sophie. She was worse. She was exact. Warmth is good, Vivian said during one meeting, flipping through Sophie's draft boards. But warmth without precision becomes sentimentality. Sophie held her gaze. Precision without warmth becomes exclusion. There was a pause in the room. Then Ethan, sitting at the far end of the table, leaned back and said, almost lazily, "That sounds like the whole campaign strategy to me." A few people smiled. Vivian did not. But later that afternoon, she sent Sophie a revised data packet with a note attached. "If you're going to argue for human language, use the strongest numbers we have." It was the closest thing to respect Sophie had received all week, and somehow that mattered. Still, not every voice in the building was so restrained. Late one afternoon, Sophie stepped into the hallway to refill her water and stopped just before the corner when she heard her own name. "So that's her," a woman said in a low voice. "The rooftop rescue girl." Another voice answered with a humorless laugh. "Old classmate. Personal guest badge. Top floor access. Come on. Maybe she's talented," the first woman said. "Maybe," the second replied. "Or maybe some people just know how to arrive through the side door." Sophie stood very still, paper cup trembling slightly in her hand. The words should not have hurt as much as they did. Nothing they said was cruel in the way Grant had been cruel. It was worse. It was polished, professional, plausibly deniable. The kind of judgment that dressed itself as observation while quietly stripping the ground from under a person's feet. By the time she made it back inside the studio, the room that had felt full of possibility half an hour earlier looked different. Smaller, temporary, borrowed. Her sketches were still pinned on the wall, but now all she could see was what everyone else might see. Not talent, not instinct, not years of buried ability finally resurfacing, but a woman who had been humiliated in a restaurant and then rescued into relevance by a man with power. Ethan found her 20 minutes later standing at the long table, carefully stacking the campaign drafts into one neat pile. "You're leaving early," he said gently. Sophie kept her eyes on the papers because looking at him would have made this harder. "I think I should." He stepped closer, concern sharpening his voice. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. That's the problem." Her hand closed over the guest badge clipped to her blazer, and with a steadiness she did not feel, she unclipped it and set it on top of the sketches. "You gave me a chance," she said softly. "But I can't be the woman people point at and explain with your name." The room went so still Sophie could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the glass and the slow, careful breath Ethan drew before he spoke. "If you walk out because this isn't right for you, I will respect it," he said. "But if you walk out because other people have decided to reduce your work to my last name, then you're letting the smallest voices in the room tell the biggest lie." She swallowed. "That's easy for you to say. You don't have to wonder whether every look means they think you were handed something you didn't earn." "No," he said quietly. "But I do know what it costs when a talented person starts apologizing for being seen." She finally looked up at him. What she found on his face was not frustration. It was conviction, steady and unflinching. "Tomorrow night we present the campaign direction to donors, city partners, and the press," he continued. "I was going to introduce the concept myself. Now I want you to do it." Sophie stared at him. "Ethan, absolutely not." "Yes. I'm not standing in front of a ballroom full of people who already think I don't belong here." Then let them find out they were wrong from the person who built the strongest idea in the room. She gave a disbelieving exhale. Do you always sound like a speech when you're trying to be persuasive? No, he said. Only when I'm right. Despite herself, she laughed. And that laugh, small, reluctant, alive, broke something open in the room. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Sophie, when we were 17, you did something for me that I never forgot. Her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? The spring showcase. Remember Tucker Hall? Pieces of memory flickered back. The corridor outside the art studio, two boys from the lacrosse team mocking Ethan's shoes, the cheap binder he used to carry, the scholarship rumors. I told them to shut up, she said. You did more than that. You picked up my drawings after they knocked them onto the floor. You looked right at them and said, talent doesn't get smaller because insecure people get louder. She blinked. I don't remember saying that. I do. He held her gaze. So no, I'm not doing you a favor. I'm recognizing something I already knew. That night Sophie went home with her draft boards in a tote bag, and Ethan's words lodged beneath her ribs where fear had been. She did not sleep much. Instead, she spread campaign mock-ups across her kitchen table, called up census data, reread scholarship testimonies, and built not just a presentation but a point of view. If this program was supposed to serve students, parents, workers rebuilding after layoffs, and small business owners with one decent chance left, then it could not sound like rich people congratulating themselves for learning the word access. It had to feel like a hand on the doorknob from the other side. The next afternoon Ethan sent a car, but Sophie texted back no thank you and took the train. It mattered to her that she arrived under her own power. The Lakeshore Civic Hotel was draped in light by the time she got there. The ballroom smelled faintly of lilies, polished wood, and expensive expectation. She stood just outside the doors, hands cold around a stack of note cards she had barely looked at in the last 10 minutes. Inside, crystal lights spilled over round tables dressed in white linen and gold glassware, and a giant screen behind the stage glowed with the campaign mark she had drawn on plain paper 4 days earlier. Open Door Initiative. Her design. Her color story. Her words. Through the gap in the doors, she saw executives, nonprofit leaders, board members, reporters, and at table 12, like some cruel final twist of fate, Grant Morrison in a dark suit with a donor badge clipped near his lapel. The air left her lungs. He was here. Of course he was here. Chicago was too small for humiliation to stay in one room for long. Before panic could take hold, Ethan appeared beside her in a midnight blue suit, calm as ever, though his eyes sharpened the instant he saw where hers had landed. He did not ask questions. He did not offer pity. He simply held out her final presentation folder, the one with her name embossed beneath the campaign title, and said, "Tonight nobody speaks for you. They listen to you." Then the host announced her name. For one suspended second, Sophie felt every old fear rise at once, every year of being overlooked, every polished voice that had ever mistaken struggle for weakness. Then she heard the first wave of applause coming from inside that ballroom, and she realized Ethan had not rescued her by pulling her out of the fire. He had rescued her by refusing to let her believe she belonged in the ashes. When Sophie stepped into the light, the ballroom did not look smaller the way rooms sometimes did when fear took over. It looked clearer. She could see the donor tables, the silver water pitchers catching the glow from the chandeliers, the city shining black and gold beyond the windows, and in the front row, Ethan watching her with the kind of steady faith that felt stronger than applause. She set her note cards on the podium and realized she did not need them. Opportunity doesn't fail because people lack talent, she began, her voice soft but clean through the speakers. It fails when people build doors that only open for those who already know the code. The room stilled. She spoke about scholarship students working late shifts, single parents trying to restart, small business owners with vision but no access, and how a program meant to help them could not look cold, distant, or polished past recognition. She explained the new name, Open Door Initiative, the warmer palette, the mark built from negative space, and welcome instead of hierarchy and control. She did not speak like someone reciting branding language. She spoke like someone who understood what it felt like to stand outside a room and wonder whether anyone inside would ever say come in. Then she did something Ethan had not expected. She set aside the clicker and told them a story. About a woman working 2 jobs who still saved old receipts because the blank backs made good sketch paper. About a kid who got scholarships but still couldn't afford unpaid internships. About what dignity felt like when people with access spoke about you instead of to you. No one in the room needed to be told that woman had been her. She never said it. She did not need to. By the time she finished, there was a beat of complete silence, that rare kind born not from uncertainty, but impact. Then the applause rose, full and immediate, rolling across the ballroom until even the staff near the back were smiling. Sophie looked down once, just long enough to breathe, and when she lifted her eyes again, she saw Grant at table 12 with his donor badge still clipped neatly in place. Only now his expression had changed. He looked like a man discovering too late that the person he had tried to belittle had become the center of the room. After the presentation, one of the board chairs approached Ethan and Sophie together and said, without hesitation, "This campaign finally sounds human." Another donor asked for Sophie by name. A city partner requested her presence at the next strategy meeting. A reporter from the Tribune asked if she would comment on the design philosophy behind the program. For the first time in years, Sophie felt something unfamiliar settle into her body. Not relief, exactly. Permission. But Chicago had not finished testing her. An hour later, as the ballroom loosened into clusters of conversation and passing champagne trays, Grant cornered her near a side corridor lined with mirrors and tall floral arrangements. He still wore confidence the way some men wore expensive cologne. Too much, and certain it would do the work for him. "Well," he said, lifting his glass slightly. "That was an impressive recovery." Sophie turned to face him fully. "Excuse me." He smiled in that smooth, dead way she recognized now for what it was. "Come on. We can skip the indignation. You got lucky. You met the right man at the right moment. And suddenly you're on a stage talking about doors." The old shame tried to rise again. This time it found nowhere to land. "No," Sophie said, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her. "I met the wrong man at the right moment. That's how I recognized the difference." His smile thinned. "You think Calloway keeps women like you around because of talent?" She held his gaze. "I think men like you always assume power only recognizes itself." Grant took a step closer. "Careful. You're in a world where reputations matter." Before Sophie could answer, another voice entered the corridor. "They do," Ethan said, coming to stand beside her. "Which is why you should leave before yours gets any worse." Grant laughed, but there was strain in it now. "You really do like playing savior." Ethan's face remained unreadable. "No, I just have very little patience for men who mistake cruelty for status." Grant looked between them and seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that he no longer controlled the temperature of the room. "You don't know what kind of donor network you're embarrassing," he said. Vivian Mercer appeared at the mouth of the corridor then, holding a tablet and wearing the kind of expression that turned men like Grant pale before they understood why. "Actually," she said coolly, "we know exactly what kind." Grant turned. "Excuse me." Vivian's gaze was icy. "Our compliance team has been reviewing submissions tied to the Morrison Foundation Partnership inquiry. Several financial disclosures appear to be inaccurate. Since you decided to approach Mr. Calloway's keynote designer during an active event, legal thought it best to accelerate the review." For the first time that evening, Grant's face lost color. "This is ridiculous." "No," Vivian said. "What's ridiculous is underestimating what rooms remember." Grant muttered something under his breath and walked away without another word, his polished outrage no longer enough to protect him. When the corridor fell quiet again, Sophie looked at Vivian, startled. Vivian lifted one shoulder. "I still prefer precision to sentiment," she said. "But for the record, your work tonight was excellent." Then she moved past them, leaving behind the faintest trace of approval Sophie had yet received from her. Ethan turned toward Sophie. "Are you all right?" She let out a long breath. "I think so." He studied her for a moment. That answer usually means not entirely. A laugh escaped her, shaky this time. "I'm getting tired of being humiliated in formal wear." Something changed in his face then. Not pity, not anger exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous. "You should never have had to survive either of those moments," he said. The simplicity of it undid her more than sympathy would have. Because he was right. She had spent so many years adjusting, absorbing, minimizing, enduring, that simple justice sounded radical. An hour later, When the ballroom had emptied and the city lights had softened into midnight, Ethan brought Sophie up to the hotel rooftop terrace. The wind was cool. Chicago stretched beneath them like a field of stars. Traffic streamed below in red and white threads, and the river cut its dark line through the city like a secret. For a while they stood side by side in silence. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the napkin from that first night, now pressed flat inside a simple glass frame. "I had my assistant do this afternoon," he said. Sophie took it with both hands, emotion catching warm in her throat. The little sketch looked different framed, not larger, not more important, just honored. Seen. Preserved against the world's instinct to crumple things that begin in fragile moments. "You kept it," she whispered. "I told you I would." She looked down at the lines. "I drew this while he was insulting me." "I know. You must have thought I was falling apart." Ethan's voice lowered. "No. I thought you were still building something even while someone was trying to diminish you. That told me more about you than anything else could have." The wind lifted a strand of her hair across her cheek. He reached out, then stopped, giving her the choice. When she didn't move away, he tucked it back gently. "You changed my life," she said. He shook his head. "No. I stepped in the moment the world was trying to look away. You did the rest." She met his eyes then, really met them, and felt something old and steady move between them. Not fantasy, not rescue, but recognition grown into something that could finally stand in the light. "You always do that," she said softly. "Do what?" "See the part of me I'm about to give up on." For the first time all evening, his composure slipped just slightly. "That may be because I never really stopped seeing it." The city moved below them. The world held its breath. And when he took her hand under the Chicago sky, it did not feel like the beginning of a fantasy. It felt like the return of something true. The next morning the announcement went out company-wide. Effective immediately, Sophie Bennett would join Callaway Brands as creative director for community initiatives. The title was real. The salary was real. The office with the view of the South Lakefront was real. The disbelief was real too. So was the work. In the weeks that followed, Sophie learned that dignity could be exhausting when you were not used to having room for it. She learned how to hold her own in meetings where people used scalability, like religion. She learned which designers argued from ego and which argued from care. She learned that Vivian Mercer respected preparation more than charm, and that once you earned one clear nod from Vivian across a conference table, most of the room adjusted accordingly. She also learned that Ethan was not easy in the ways lazy people imagined powerful men were easy. He was attentive, yes. Thoughtful, yes. But he demanded clarity. He hated vague thinking. He crossed out pretty slogans that said nothing. He asked what every decision cost, who it excluded, what it assumed. In meetings he gave Sophie no special protection. If anything, he challenged her more. At first that stung. Then she understood. He was not shielding her from the room because he expected her to stand in it. One Thursday night near 11, she found him alone in the brand archive room reviewing proofs under a soft lamp. The office was mostly dark, city lights reflected in the glass like scattered coins. "You're still here," she said. He glanced up. "So are you." She held up a stack of revised print mock-ups. "I'm fixing the scholarship packet." He studied her face. "We're avoiding going home." That landed too cleanly. Sophie set the proofs down. "Is it that obvious?" "To me? Usually." She laughed softly and sat on the edge of the table. "My apartment still feels like the place where the old version of my life is stored." The old version or the honest one? She considered that. Maybe both. He leaned back in his chair, sleeves rolled, tie gone, looking younger like this. Less CEO. More boy from the back row with charcoal on his fingers and too much depth in his eyes. "Do you ever miss who you were before all of this?" she asked. "All of what?" She gestured vaguely. The tower, the company, the scale of his life. He was quiet for a moment. "I miss being less necessary to everyone." She looked at him, surprised. He gave a small, tired smile. "Success is strange. People think it gives you freedom. Sometimes it just gives your time away to bigger rooms." The honesty of that settled between them. "You really built all this?" she asked. He glanced through the glass, toward the sleeping city. "I built enough of it to know which parts are worth keeping. And which parts aren't. The parts that teach people their usefulness determines their dignity." Sophie held his gaze. There it was again, that line running straight through him. the one she had noticed at 17 and nearly forgotten how to trust. Beneath the money, beneath the influence, beneath the world that moved when he spoke, there was still a man measuring success by whether anyone could breathe inside it. She looked down at the proof pages. You know, when I was 19, I got into the Art Institute's design program. Ethan stilled. You never told me that. I never told anyone, really. I deferred because of my mom's chemo. Then I couldn't afford to go back. After she died, I told myself it didn't matter anymore. The silence after that was gentle and full. I'm sorry, he said. So was I, she replied. For a long time. He stood and came around the table, not close enough to overwhelm her, just near enough that she could feel the quiet steadiness of him. You don't owe your grief a lifelong career sacrifice, he said. No, she whispered. But grief doesn't. Exactly, send forwarding instructions. A sad smile touched his mouth. Then, because something in the room had become too real to leave untouched, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the folded note she had once slipped into his sketchbook. Don't become what hurt you. Sophie stared. You kept that too? For 15 years. Why? Because there were moments I needed to read it. There was no performance in the admission. No attempt to impress her with vulnerability. Just truth, quiet as winter light. What happened? She asked softly. Ethan looked down at the note between his fingers. When Calloway started growing, there were people who wanted it sharper, colder, more efficient, more elite. Every time I got tired, every time I thought maybe that was just the price of being taken seriously, I remembered a girl in art class who looked at me like I still had a choice. Emotion rose so quickly in her chest, she had to look away. Ethan, you said one sentence and it became a line I never let myself cross. When she looked back, the room had changed. Or maybe they had. He lifted the note once, then folded it carefully and tucked it away again. You've been changing my life longer than you realize, Sophie. The words stayed with her all weekend. So did he. But real life never let tenderness exist untested for long. 3 days later, a business site ran a short, vicious item with no byline. Calloway CEO fast-tracks former classmate after high-profile charity gala. It was the sort of thing written to sound like a question while functioning like an accusation. There were no real facts in it. That didn't stop it from spreading. By noon the next day, Sophie felt it in the office again. The glances, the careful pauses, the way conversations shifted when she entered a room. She should have expected it. Still, by the time Ethan found her in the design studio, pinning revised community center visuals onto a board with fingers that felt strangely numb, she was already back in that old emotional territory where dignity required too much energy to hold. He walked in without preamble and set his phone on the table so she could see the article. I'm having legal respond, he said. And PR is preparing a statement. Sophie kept pinning. That'll make it bigger. Maybe. She pushed another tack into the wall harder than necessary. You know what makes it worse? Part of me is angry not because it's unfair, but because it sounds believable. Ethan went very still. To who? She turned then, tired and raw in a way she hadn't let herself be around him yet. To anyone who's ever watched a man with power choose a woman and assumed that explained everything. His face changed. Not because of wounded pride. Because he understood. Sophie, he said, voice low. If you want to step back until this dies down, I'll support that. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. No. I'm done stepping back every time the world gets suspicious of a woman being visible. Something like pride moved across his features then, quiet and bright. Good, he said. Later that afternoon, Vivian called an all-hands meeting for the community initiatives team. Everyone gathered in the strategy room. Designers, analysts, coordinators, 2 junior writers who never stopped whispering, and Sophie at the far end of the table wondering if this was the moment her legitimacy would be professionally dissected. Vivian stood at the head of the room with a tablet in one hand. I dislike gossip, she said, mainly because it tends to be unintelligent. Since some of you have apparently been consuming it on company time, let's be clear. No one breathed. Ms. Bennett was hired because the Open Door relaunch outperformed months of existing work in under 1 week, increased donor conversion projections by 18%, and raised direct partner engagement by 23% before public rollout. She set the tablet down. If anyone here believes those outcomes were caused by nostalgia and a nice dress, speak now so I know exactly where to focus remedial training. No one moved. Vivian's gaze swept the table. Good. Then, with the faintest turn towards Sophie, she added, meeting adjourned. It was not warmth. It was something better. Public correction. When the room emptied, Sophie lingered. I didn't know you were going to do that. Vivian gathered her papers. Neither did I, until I got irritated enough. Sophie smiled despite herself. Vivian paused, then said, without looking up, you may not realize this, but women like us rarely get the luxury of being assumed competent. Some of us simply get more expensive shoes before we learn it. Sophie felt that sentence land somewhere deep. Vivian finally looked at her. Keep your head up, Ms. Bennett. Let your work make people earn their doubts. By early spring, Open Door was no longer a campaign. It was becoming a movement. City colleges wanted in. Workforce groups wanted joint branding support. A neighborhood theater on the west side offered its old building as a pilot site for job skills workshops, portfolio labs, and small business pop-ups. Ethan's board, seeing the momentum, approved a major investment into turning the theater into a flagship community hub. Sophie walked through the building for the first time on a rainy Tuesday with a hard hat on her head and Ethan beside her. The place smelled like dust, damp wood, and forgotten applause. Rows of worn seats faced a stage with peeling paint. Light fell through cracked high windows and pale shafts. Somewhere backstage, an old mural showed through damaged plaster. Stars, hands, city lines. It's beautiful, Sophie whispered. Most things are before people decide they're too inconvenient to save. She turned to him. You really think this can work? He looked at the stage, then at her. I think you're looking at the physical version of what you've been building from the start. She stepped into the aisle, imagining it all at once. Design labs where teenagers learned portfolio basics, resume clinics for laid-off parents, grant workshops for small entrepreneurs, rotating gallery walls, a lobby full of warmth instead of judgment. She could see it. Not vaguely. Completely. A place where the door did not ask who your parents were, what school you went to, or whether your clothes looked expensive enough to deserve entry. What would you call it? Ethan asked. She thought of the napkin, the campaign, the sentence that had followed her out of the ballroom and into every meeting since. Open Door House, she said. No, just Open Door. He smiled. Good. Keep it human. As renovation began, so did the final pressure. A major donor balked at the theater investment and threatened to pull funding unless Callaway partnered with a more established image consultant. That consultant, naturally, was tied to Grant Morrison's network. When Ethan refused, the donor requested a board review. The review meeting took place on a Monday morning under a ceiling so high it made most people feel smaller on purpose. Sophie had no seat at the table. She knew that. She also knew the entire future of Open Door might be decided by people who had never taken the train home after being told they did not belong anywhere worth entering. So she waited outside the boardroom with revised projections, community testimonials, and one large mounted rendering of the restored theater. After 40 minutes, the doors opened unexpectedly. Ethan stepped out. You're up, he said. She stared at him. Excuse me. The board wants to hear from the person who actually understands why this matters. He held the door. Inside sat 12 people in expensive restraint. Sophie walked to the end of the table, set the rendering up, and did not let herself think. She spoke, not about branding this time, about dignity, about how access failed when it was designed by people who had never been locked out, about what happened when a city stopped treating talent like something only polished families produced. She showed them the cost per participant projections, the partnership maps, the volunteer pipeline, the conversion pathway from scholarship programs to business mentorship. Then she put the numbers down and said the one thing numbers could not hold. Some people spend their whole lives learning how not to embarrass themselves in rooms built to remind them they're temporary. Open Door is not charity. It is correction. Silence followed. A man near the far end, silver hair, old money posture, folded his hands and asked, and what guarantees do we have that this won't simply become another underutilized city project? Sophie met his eyes. None. Because human beings aren't guarantees. They're responsibilities. He sat back. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan, from the head of the table, said, that will be all. She stepped out into the corridor feeling like she had left part of her heart on the boardroom carpet. 10 minutes later, Ethan emerged. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, and she knew. We got the vote. We got the vote. She exhaled so sharply it turned into a laugh. He smiled too, rare and unguarded. Unanimous after your speech. She stared. You're kidding. I'm not. Even the silver-haired human statue. Especially him. She laughed again, and this time Ethan did something he had not done in public before. He took her hand. Only for a second. Just long enough for the moment to become real. By the time Open Door officially launched in early June, Chicago had begun to warm into itself. Trees along the sidewalks carried full green leaves. The river flashed bright beneath the bridges. And on the restored marquee of the old West Side Theater, new letters gleamed against the evening sky. Open Door. The opening crowd spilled down the block. Students, parents, city partners, donors, journalists, neighborhood families, former scholarship recipients, and people who had simply heard there was a place opening that might finally speak to them without condescension. Inside, the lobby glowed in warm amber tones drawn directly from Sophie's original palette. The welcome desk curved like an embrace. The wayfinding signs were clean, elegant, and clear enough that nobody had to feel stupid for needing them. On one wall, framed behind glass, sat the first napkin sketch she had ever drawn for the idea. Beneath it, in small type, were the words, "Some doors should open wider after what they've seen." Sophie stood in the balcony for a moment before the formal program began, looking down at the crowd moving through the space she had first imagined as ink on paper. Her throat tightened. "This is what your face does when it's trying not to cry," Ethan said quietly from behind her. She turned. He was in a dark suit again, but tonight there was no rooftop tension around him, no emergency, no rescue. Just pride. Just certainty. "You remember everything, don't you?" she asked. "Only the things that matter." She looked back down at the crowd. "I used to think changing your life would feel louder. And now," she smiled through the ache in her throat, "now I think it feels like being allowed to stand where you were always meant to." His gaze held on her for a moment that seemed to gather every version of them. The teenagers in art class, the strangers on the rooftop, the man who stepped in, the woman who stood back up. Then the host called them both toward the stage. The applause that greeted them was already strong, but it rose further when Sophie stepped forward to the podium. This time she did use note cards. Not because she needed them, because she wanted to hold the moment with both hands. "When people tell stories like this," she began, "they often focus on the dramatic part. The rescue. The coincidence. The powerful person stepping in." A few people smiled. She glanced toward Ethan. "But the truth is, a life doesn't change because someone with money notices you. A life changes when someone refuses to let the world misname your worth." The room went quiet. She spoke about design, access, work, and care. About the danger of polished exclusion. About what it meant to build a place where talent didn't have to arrive already translated into privilege. Then she stepped aside and turned toward Ethan, who joined her at center stage. He took the microphone, but instead of launching into donor thanks or board acknowledgments, he looked at Sophie first. "I was asked recently," he said, voice carrying through the theater, "why this project mattered enough for us to fight for it." He paused. "The answer is simple. Because too many systems are built by people who have forgotten what it feels like to stand outside them." His gaze stayed on her another heartbeat before turning back to the audience. "And because a long time ago, someone I knew reminded me not to become what hurt people just because the world would reward it." Sophie's breath caught. A murmur moved through the crowd, warm and aware. Ethan reached into his inside pocket one last time and took out the folded note, now mounted in a small frame like the napkin had been. He handed it to her in front of everyone. The words were visible under the stage lights. "Don't become what hurt you. I've carried this for 15 years, he said. "Tonight, I think it belongs back with the person who wrote it." The applause began before she could answer. It rolled through the theater, rose to the balcony, filled the rafters. Sophie took the frame with both hands. By then she was crying a little. Not the broken kind. The cleansing kind. The kind that came when the body finally accepted that something long denied had become real. After the ribbon cutting, after the press photos, after the speeches and handshakes and children already asking where the design workshop would be held, the night settled into something quieter. The crowd thinned. The marquee still glowed outside. And in the old backstage corridor, where the walls smelled faintly of fresh paint over history, Ethan found Sophie standing near the original mural that renovation crews had restored. Stars, hands, city lines. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie looked at him and said, very softly, "You know what the strangest part is?" "What? The night at the rooftop? I thought that was the moment my life split in two." He waited. She smiled. But it didn't. It just revealed what had been true all along. One man looked at me and saw someone to diminish. Another looked at me and saw someone to remember. Ethan stepped closer. "This was never about saving you, Sophie. I know. It was about making sure no one got to misjudge you without being corrected." She laughed softly through the last of her tears. "That's a very CEO way to describe love." His expression changed at the word. Not startled, just honest. "Maybe," he said. "Then let me try again." He came close enough that the air between them shifted. "I loved you first as the girl who saw more than anyone else. I loved you later as the woman who kept building beauty even while life was trying to humble her. And I love you now because no room is more truthful after you walk into it." Emotion moved through her so quickly it stole speech for a second. So she did what was truer than words. She stepped into him. His hands came to her waist gently, as if even now he understood that care had to be chosen, never assumed. When he kissed her, it was not hurried, not triumphant. It felt like recognition finally being allowed to arrive where it had been heading all along. Outside, Chicago moved under summer light and traffic and all the ordinary noise of a city that kept going no matter how many lives changed inside it. But in that restored theater, beneath a mural saved from ruin, something quiet and permanent took root. The man with millions had not changed Sophie's life by handing her one. He had changed it by stepping in when cruelty thought it owned the room, by seeing her before the world was ready to, by giving her back the space to become fully visible, and by loving her in the one way that mattered most. Not as someone to rescue, as someone to stand beside. And for Sophie Bennett, who had spent too many years making herself smaller for rooms that had never earned her humility, that was the richest thing anyone had ever given her.